Alright, welcome back to Mr. Berry Lectures. This is Chapter 15, Years of Crisis, Section 2, A Worldwide Depression. So, both literally the American dollar is going to fall flat on its face, and we are going to have problems in Germany, as you can see on the right, that are so severe that children can play with money in the street. Alright, main idea for today's notes, economics. A lot of what we're going to talk about today deals with economics, so just be prepared for that. An economic depression in the United States spread throughout the world and lasted for over a decade, or 10 years. Why does this matter now, and why are we spending time here today? Many social and economic programs and institutions and situations that come out of the global depression today to combat the global depression or the Great Depression for that matter, are still operating today. Alright, let me give you a little background on what's going on before we get into this financial crisis period in the 1920s and 30s. Okay, so by the 1920s, most European nations are rebuilding from World War I. Of course, a lot of structural and infrastructure damage has been done to buildings and roads and all kinds of things in Europe. However, they're also trying to rebuild from the economic situations going on there. Obviously, a lot of nations over there are owing debts to each other. Germany and Austria, for instance, owe a lot of reparations payments. These countries are going to receive loans from the more prosperous United States in many cases because, in contrast to many other countries in Europe, the United States actually was pretty confident in its economy. Yet, during this time, even though we're pretty confident, the American economy had weaknesses that would bring about a worldwide depression. Alright, let us begin. So, post-war Europe's conditions. What is Europe like around the time of the 1920s, after the First World War? So, the cost of the First World War was immense. I think we saw in one of our notes sections a chapter or two ago that the First World War cost something like $6 trillion in total. That's by only by 1918, where you've got $6 trillion in the war. So obviously these countries have a lot of money that they either need to pay back to each other or just use to fix themselves. And one of the problems that they're going to have during this period also is that they have a lot of new unstable democracies. The end of the war kind of brought about the fall of a lot of kingdoms and empires in Europe. I mean, obviously, like the Russian Empire had fallen in our last chapter, they had a provisional government which was nominally democratic, but they're actually taken out by the communists. And Austria and Germany and a couple of other places have this same situation. So they're removing kings or emperors and becoming new democratic governments. A lot of these democracies hadn't existed pretty much ever in Europe. Many of them had pretty much the last 400 or 500 years been controlled by some sort of absolute monarchist or some government other than that really didn't allow for parliaments. Now, people therefore have a lot of, or well, not a lot of, very little experience with representative government, and so a lot of them actually go into forming coalition governments. They have far too many political parties, since they don't really know how to organize themselves, to exist or run efficiently, and many of these governments are extremely temporary. You know, if you know much about American, the American political landscape, we have like basically two parties, and even we don't run very efficiently. So in some countries where they had a dozen or more political groups, it was almost impossible for one party to win enough support to govern effectively. When no single party won a majority, you get what is your vocab term here, a coalition government, or a temporary alliance of several political parties. This alliance was needed to form a parliamentary majority, and because these parties disagreed on so many political policies, these coalitions seldom lasted very long. Frequent changes in government made it hard for democratic countries to develop strong leadership and move toward long-term goals. These weaknesses, of course, in coalition government became a major problem in times of crisis when they really needed to get something done. Voters in several of these countries were willing, therefore, to sacrifice democratic government for a strong authoritarian type of government. But we will get to that in Section 3. Coalition government is one of your vocab terms. It is simply a government controlled by a temporary alliance of several political parties. Next, let's look at one of the democratic governments to come out during this time. So Germany's new democratic government was set up in 1919. They kicked the Kaiser out, and this new democratic government was known as the Weimar Republic. It is named after the city where the National Assembly met, which is Weimar, and the Weimar Republic had serious weaknesses from the start. First, Germany lacked a strong democratic tradition. They really hadn't had any idea how to run a democratic government. And furthermore, post-war Germany had several major political parties and a lot of many minor ones. Worst of all, millions of Germans blamed the Weimar Republic, not their wartime leaders, which they probably should have blamed, for the country's defeat in post-war humiliation caused by the Versailles Treaty. Now, during this time, you also have inflation causing crisis in Germany. Germany also faced enormous economic problems that had begun during the war. Unlike Britain and France, Germany had not greatly increased its wartime taxes. To pay the expenses of the war, the Germans had simply printed money, which was a bad plan in retrospect. After Germany's defeat, this paper money steadily lost its value. Burdened with heavy reparations payments to the Allies and with other economic problems, Germany printed even more money. You can see a trend here. As a result, the value of the mark, which is Germany's currency, was as its currency was called, fell sharply. Obviously, its value was greatly diminished. Severe inflation therefore set in. The more money that you print, the less each mark, in this example, are worth. Germans needed more and more money to buy even the most basic goods. For example, in Berlin, a loaf of bread cost less than a mark in 1918 during the war, and more than 160 marks in 1922, and then something like 20 billion marks in late 1923. So even within that 1 year, they'd printed so much money, and that the mark had become so worthless that you actually had to have wheelbarrows full of marks to buy anything. This is why, by the way, you can see these children playing with stacks of marks as building blocks. It's because they're actually probably less expensive to have thousands and thousands of marks per block than it is to actually buy them toys. People took wheelbarrows full of money to buy food, like I said. So it was kind of ridiculous. As a result, many Germans questioned the value of their new democratic government because of this great, what is called hyperinflation. Now, Weimar Republic is one of your vocab terms. It is the republic that was established in Germany in 1919 and then ended in 1933. And I bet you can guess who took over in 1933, but I'm not going to mention that because we're going to get to it in section 3. Okay. A couple of other good examples of what people did with marks because they were so worthless is actually burning them and wallpapering their homes, because it was actually cheaper here, for example, to burn marks in your stove to keep your house warm than it was to actually go buy firewood. That is not a joke. They really did do this. People were also known to have wallpapered their houses. There are several examples. If you go Google wallpapering walls with German marks, you can find a lot of these. It was actually, again, cheaper to wallpaper your house with money than it was to actually go buy wallpaper or paint. So go figure. All right. So next here we have kind of the economic attempts at stability in the Weimar Republic. Germany, I should mention, is actually able to recover from the 1923 inflation largely thanks to the work of an international committee. The committee was headed by a man named Charles Dawes, who was an American banker. The Dawes Plan, as it is called, provided for a $200 million loan from the American banks to stabilize the German currency and strengthen its economy, mainly because American money is still worth something. The plan also set, I should mention, more realistic schedules for Germany's reparation payments. So if you've ever seen those commercials on television where it says, hey, are you in debt? We can lower your payments. It's kind of what the Dawes Plan did. Now, put into effect in 1924, the Dawes Plan helped slow inflation, and as the German economic power began to recover, it attracted more loans and investments from the United States. By the late 1920s, like 1929, German factories were actually producing as much as they had before the First World War, which is not awesome compared to the rest of the world that actually was doing okay, but it was better than they had been doing during their period of hyperinflation, obviously. Also during this time, there is an effort at lasting peace. So as prosperity returned to Germany, Germany's foreign minister, Gustav Stresemann, and France's Foreign Minister Astrid Briand tried to improve relations between their countries. In 1925, the two ministers met in Locarno, Switzerland, with officials from Belgium, Italy, and Britain. These officials signed a treaty promising that France and Germany would never again make war against each other. Obviously, we know that doesn't pan out. But anyway, Germany had also agreed to respect the existing borders of France and Belgium, which it had not done during the First World War. It then was admitted to the League of Nations for the first time, although the League of Nations had been around since the signing of the the Versailles Treaty. They were not allowed in initially because obviously they were to blame for the war and obviously could not be trusted. In 1928, the hopes raised by the Locarno Treaty led to another pact called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, or the Kellogg-Briand Peace Pact. Frank Kellogg, the U.S. Secretary of State, arranged this agreement with Francis Briand, and almost every country in the world, including the Soviet Union, shockingly, signed. They pledged to, quote, renounce war as an instrument of national policy. Unfortunately, the treaty had no real way or means to enforce its provisions, and the League of Nations, which was the obvious choice as enforcer, had no armed forces, so they couldn't do anything about it either. The refusal of the United States to join the League of Nations also weakened this because we were not in support of supporting any of these things. So nonetheless, the peace agreement seemed a good start. We really thought that this was going to be helpful. Unfortunately, it turns out it really kind of wasn't. One thing that these peace treaties really didn't prevent, however, was going to be an economic and financial collapse. In the late 1920s, American economic prosperity had largely sustained the world economy, and we were pretty much propping up the rest of the world. If the U.S. economy weakened, the whole world's economic system might collapse, and in 1929 it did. So, a flawed U.S. economy. So, despite prosperity, several weaknesses in the United States economy caused serious problems for both us and the rest of the world. These included uneven distribution of wealth, overproduction by businesses and agricultural, and the fact that many Americans were buying less. By 1929, American factories were turning out nearly half of the world's industrial goods. The rising productivity led to enormous profits. However, this new wealth was not evenly distributed. The richest 5% of the population received something like 30% or 33% of all personal income in 1929. Yet, 60% of all Americans' families earned something like $2,000 a year. Thus, most families were too poor to buy the goods being produced. Unable to sell all their goods, these store owners eventually cut back their orders from factories, and factories in turn reduced production and laid off workers. A downward economic spiral basically begins here. As more workers lost their jobs, families bought even fewer goods, and in turn factories made further cuts in production and laid off more workers. See, that's kind of a downward spiral. That is a problem. Okay? During the 1920s, overproduction affected American farmers as well. Scientific farming methods and new farm machinery had dramatically increased crop yields, so we were actually making way too much food. American farmers were producing more food, and meanwhile they faced new competition from farmers in Australia, Latin America, and Europe. As a result, a worldwide surplus of agricultural products drove prices and profits down. Unable to sell their crops at any profit, many farmers could not pay off the bank loans that kept them in business. I mean, they had taken out a lot of loans to buy a lot of this equipment, and they hadn't paid it off, so that was sort of an issue. Their unpaid debts, therefore, weakened banks and forced some to close. The dangerous signs of overproduction by factories and by farms should have warned people against gambling on the stock market, yet no one heeds that warning either. Now, Financial Collapse Part 2, the stock market crashes. Now, in 1929, New York City's Wall Street was the financial capital of the world. Banks and investment companies, of course, lined its sidewalks. At the Wall Street's New York Stock Exchange, optimism about the booming U.S. economy showed in soaring prices for stocks. Yet to get in on the boom, many middle-income people began buying stocks on margin. This basically means they were paying a small percentage of the stock price as a down payment and then borrowed the rest from a stockbroker. So this puts them in debt just to begin with, but they figured after a while they were going to make enough that, it would all eventually work out. The system worked well, of course, as long as stock prices were rising, therefore. And however, if they fell, investors had no money to pay off the loan. So thus you have a problem. In September 1929, some investors began to think that the stock prices were unnaturally high, which quite frankly they were, and they started selling their stocks, believing that the prices would soon go down. So if you think, this price is eventually going to drop off, we need to sell this before we lose some money, that's what they're doing, okay? By Thursday, October 24th, the gradual lowering of stock prices had become an all-out slide downward. Panic, obviously, results. People start freaking out. Everyone wanted to sell their stocks and no one wanted to buy. I mean, you don't buy stocks when they're on the downward slide. So when everything is on the downward slide, it's kind of a problem. Okay, so prices plunged to a new low on Tuesday, October 29th. This is what we kind of often call Black Tuesday. And a record 16 million stocks were sold, which is a lot then. I think we pretty much do stuff like that on a daily basis now. But the market collapsed at this point. Okay, millions of dollars were lost as well. All right, the Great Depression. People could not pay the money that they owed on margin purchases, and stocks they had bought at high prices were now basically worthless. Within months of the crash, unemployment rates had begun to rise in industrial production, prices and wages declined. A long business slump, which we would now come to call the Great Depression, followed. It is also one of your vocab terms, by the way, the severe economic slump that follows the collapse of the U.S. stock market in 1929. The stock market crash alone, however, I should point out, did not cause the Great Depression, but it quickened the collapse of the economy and made the Depression more difficult. By 1932, factory production had been cut in half, thousands of businesses had failed, and by 1932, many banks had closed as well. Around 9 million people lost the money in their savings accounts when banks had no money to pay them, and many farmers lost their lands when they could not make mortgage payments like we mentioned earlier. By 1933, 1/4 of all American workers had no jobs, so you have literally a 25% unemployment rate, which is insane. So to give you an example, like the most recent economic downturn that we had, the quote-unquote depression of 2008, or the recession, sometimes people call it, we had something like 8 or 9% unemployment in some places in the United States. And that's a high number. A normal number of unemployment is like 4 to 5%, 4 being really good and 5 being just generally pretty normal. But 8-9% is really high. It's double our normal unemployment rate. But 25% is insane. Okay? Now, let us look at how this kind of affects the rest of the world. The collapse of the American economy sent shockwaves around the world. Worried American bankers demanded repayment for their overseas loans, and American investors withdrew their money from Europe. The American market for European goods dropped sharply as the United States Congress placed high tariffs on imported goods so that American dollars would stay in the United States and pay for American goods. Unfortunately, this policy backfires, and conditions worsened for the United States in general. Many countries that depended on exporting goods to the United States therefore also suffered because these tariffs prevented them from being able to cheaply send them in. Moreover, when the United States raised tariffs, it set off a chain reaction. Other nations imposed their own higher tariffs, and so we couldn't send anything to them either. World trade in general dropped off by 65% during the period of the 1920s and 30s. This contributed further to the economic downturn of the 1920s and 30s, and unemployment rates in pretty much every country on the planet soared. Now, Asia and Latin America also had big issues during this period of time because of war debts and dependence on American loans and investments. Excuse me, we'll return to Latin America in a second. Austria's largest bank fails in 1931, and in Asia, both farmers and urban workers suffered suffered as the value of exports fell by half in between 1929 and 31. The crash was felt heavily in Latin America as well, as European and U.S. demand for such Latin American products as sugar, beef, and copper dropped. Prices collapsed. So we really couldn't buy anything from them, and because most of their economy is based on exports to other countries, they were kind of in trouble. You'll notice in the charts to the right, by the way, you can see world imports and exports really dropping off by about 2/3 between 29 and 33, and unemployment rates are going up to about 1932 and then slowly recovering through the late 1930s as we approach the Second World War. Germany, you'll notice, does a particularly good job of recovering because a lot of people are joining their army and other things in the state, producing arms and ammunition and so on. So they are really ramping up towards something, which we'll see in the next chapter. Okay, so let's look at how the world confronts this crisis. Now, the Depression confronted democracies with a serious challenge to their economic and political systems. Each country met this crisis in its own way. But let's first look at Britain and how it takes steps to improve its economy. The Depression hit Britain severely. To meet the emergency, British voters actually elected a multi-party coalition known as the National Government, which is a really uncreative name. But anyway, it passed high protective tariffs, increased taxes, and regulated the currency. It also lowered interest rates to encourage industrial growth. These measures brought about a slow but steady recovery, and by 1937 unemployment had been cut in half and production had risen above 1929 levels. So Britain, thankfully, avoided political extremes and preserved its democracy. Next, we'll look at France and some socialist governments in the Scandinavian areas. Okay, so unlike Britain, France had a more self-sufficient economy. In 1930, several years after the war, 10 years after the war, France is still pretty heavily agricultural, and it was generally less dependent on foreign trade. Nevertheless, by 1935, 1 million French workers were unemployed. The economic crisis contributed to political instability, and in 1933, 5 coalition governments formed and fell, so that was quick. Many political leaders were frightened by the growth and anti-democratic forces both in France and other parts of Europe, so in 1936, moderates, socialists, and communists formed a coalition. The Popular Front, as this was called, passed a series of reforms to help the workers. Unfortunately, price increases quickly offset wage gains, and unemployment remained high. Yet in France, they also were able to preserve democratic government. So then let's look at the Scandinavian countries. So socialist governments find solutions. The socialist governments in Scandinavian countries of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, for example, also met the challenges of economic crisis successfully. They built their recovery on programs on an existing tradition of cooperative community action. In Sweden, the government sponsored massive public works projects that kept many people employed and producing. All the Scandinavian countries raised pensions for the elderly and increased unemployment insurance, subsidies for housing, and other welfare benefits. To pay for these benefits, the governments taxed all citizens. Democracy, again, here remains intact, so they are not taken over by any political extreme. Now, let's talk about the recovery in the United States. In 1932, the first presidential election after the Depression had begun, the United States workers elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His confident manner appealed to millions of Americans who felt bewildered by the Depression. On March 4, 1933, the new president sought to restore Americans' faith in their nation. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is quoted during this period as saying, in his inaugural address, quote, "This great nation will endure as it has endured. We will revive and we will prosper. Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself," a very popular quote there, "and nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." He is saying again, we can fix this, let's do that. So in March of 1933, shortly after he is inaugurated, he enacts a set of social public works programs called the New Deal, which pulled the nation out of the Depression's slow. The New Deal included a lot of large public works projects, which helped to provide jobs for the unemployed. The new government agencies gave financial help to businesses and farms, and large amounts of public money were spent on welfare and relief programs. Roosevelt and his advisors believed that the government spending would create jobs and start a recovery. Regulations were imposed to reform the stock market and the banking system as well. The New Deal did eventually reform the American economic system, and Roosevelt's leadership preserved the country's faith in democratic political system. It also established him as a leader of democracy in the world, and which was threatened by ruthless dictators, as we will see in Section 3. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by the way, and the New Deal are vocab terms of yours. He is the President of the United States between 33 and 45, who led the nation out of the Great Depression and through most of the Second World War. The New Deal is, of course, FDR's economic reform program designed to solve the problems created by the Great Depression. By the way, one of the programs that comes out of the New Deal, the Work Progress Administration, is actually known for building the main building of Greenville High School. So I know at Jail Man that's probably not very interesting to you, but yeah. So they build a lot of new buildings, one of which happens to be Greenville High School. Alright, in Section 3, we will see, while many of the nations that we talk today are able to maintain democracy and a democratic government through the Depression, some nations like Germany and Italy are not so lucky. And we will see that when we return to that in Section 3. Alright, thanks for listening. Have a good one. Bye.